Hey, fellow data and analytics aficionados, and thank you for joining me in today's episode of Caserta's Data Intelligence webinar series. I'm your host, Remy Rosenbaum, and today we have a very special presentation for you, all about alternative data and how to use it to navigate the COVID economy. So what is alternative data? Put simply, alternative data is data that has not traditionally been used by financial markets, but holds untapped insights for investors and analysts. From social media to satellite imagery, web scraping, transaction receipts, traffic patterns, the quantity of relevant, actionable, valuable data in the world is exploding, and investors are increasingly taking advantage of this trend. And it's not just financial services that are gorging on alternative data for high-value insights, but also insurance, healthcare, and other verticals. So to dig deeper into alternative data and see how you can use this to propel your business forward in uncertain, unprecedented times, I've invited two excellent presenters who are going to shed light on alternative data and how leading firms are using it. First up, we have Caserta's founding CEO, Joe Caserta. And aside from founding and running our leading data and analytics consultancy, Joe is also a best-selling author, a recognized thought leader, and gives talks on stage and around the world evangelizing data and analytics. Next up, we have Quandl's co-founder and chief data officer, Abraham Thomas. Abraham leads a team that has evaluated thousands of unusual and untapped data sources for their information, content, and insight. And prior to founding Quandl, Abraham was a senior portfolio manager at a multi-billion-dollar global hedge fund where he managed quantitative portfolios encompassing a variety of geographies, asset classes, and investment styles. So thank you for joining us today. And now a bit of housekeeping and we'll get started. Caserta, for those of you who don't already know, is a professional services firm. We are laser focused on data and analytics engagement, and we deliver strategic assessments with actionable roadmaps, craft innovative designs and architectures, and perform advanced implementations that leverage the latest technologies and proven frameworks and methodologies. All of our teams are led by data scientists who are leaders in their fields, and data engineers who can show a relentless dedication to solving our clients' data and analytics challenges fast. Our complimentary data and analytics expert webinar series is designed to give you insight into today's hottest technological trends and issues. And after today's presentation, I encourage you to speak with us about any questions on how to apply alternative data or any data and analytics problems that you've learned about today at your firm. Our initial discussions are always free, and if we do find an opportunity to work together, then we can gladly discuss the next steps. And if not, we will happily point you in the right direction. Just so you know, after the webinar, I'm going to send you a recording to the email address you provided. And should you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the questions panel on the right, and we'll answer them during our live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Joe, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Remy. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to hearing Abraham as well. Remy, just confirm you can see my screen?
You are good to go.
Okay, great. So I tried to summarize what I'm going to talk about into three major things when it comes to COVID. As a company, you most likely want to do these three things, right? You want to reopen, get back to reality, to what was reality, recover what you've lost over the past 3 months. And in order to do that, reimagine what your new reality is going to look like going forward. And we're going to talk about each one of those three things over the next, I'm going to take about 20 minutes or so. So let's see. So yeah, Remy already gave my bio. You know, I'm just a data nerd that's going to just share what I've done with data over the last 3 decades. So in 20 minutes. So I want to start with a quote, and I put a question mark here because it actually, in my research, I found a data quality issue on the internet where there's a few different opinions on who actually made this quote. Seems like the general consensus is Churchill, but I'm not exactly sure. But the quote is, "Never waste a good crisis." And I'll just share that Caserta as a company, we shut our offices in Midtown Manhattan on March 10th, and we had to reinvent the way we do our business. We've been working 100% remote, and we've been focusing on helping businesses that realize that without data, without being able to be in the same room, you really have no business. So reinventing the way businesses are run is being done in an unprecedented rate right now. This is probably, barring the fact that we've been in a pandemic and a world crisis for the past 3 months, as a data nerd, it is probably one of the most exciting times that we've been in business. So why is that? Why do we care about this alternative data strategy now? It's because we are living, right, in the making of history that we will be talking about for our lifetime and generations to come. You know, where else, when else have we ever lived in a global health pandemic coupled with like domestic protests that are going on all over the world, amidst a trade war across some of the greatest world powers, and experiencing such economic disruption that, again, living high in the hog 3 months ago to having like the highest unemployment rate since the world, since the U.S. Great Depression, and in a course of weeks. Never has this all of these things like have happened at the same time, at the same place, to the same groups of people across an entire country and world. So we are living in a new reality, and the new reality is even the best, most efficient, most prosperous run companies in the world are struggling today in some shape or form. So when that happens, everything that we know about running a business needs to be checked at the door, and we have to think of a new way to do it, because the old way just isn't going to work. So internal data analysis, things like checking our typical KPIs for our organization don't matter, right? And probably in years to come, I could predict that we will probably be hard coding to eliminate the anomaly that happened in Q1 and Q2 of 2020, because it's just going to skew everybody's numbers when you're trying to make decisions in the future. But for right now, we have to figure out what are the indicators we should be looking at, and where do we get them? And they're not from within our company. We have to be able to, in real time, understand what the climate is in the world. So how do we do that? How do we take outside indicators and use it to assess, predict, and strategize our own company's outcome, right? So that we can actually come out ahead. That's the goal of this session. So what we're recommending is that, if you work for a hedge fund, it's not a new concept to you, right? It's called macro investment strategies. So macro investment strategies are when you take outside global events and you use those events to try to predict the outcome of an investment. What we're seeing now, and what we're helping our clients do now, is take that strategy and turn it inward towards your own company. So doing things like, okay, interest rates, politics, those are all like really common things. Everybody knows how to do that, I think. Exchange rates, right? FX data is not a new concept, but things like a coronavirus pandemic, global protests, rioting and looting in all the major cities in the US and across the world. Where does that data come from? How do you get that data? And what do you do with it after you get it, right? All of these systemic factors that are now need to be considered and analyzed in order to come up with a strategy on not only make you compete, but make you survive, right? So that's the goal. So this is a standard slide that comes out of Eagle Alpha. where it just kind of generally categorizes all the different types of alternative data that's out there. Not new. Abraham will talk about, you can get all of this with the click of a button on the Quandl website. But what we're going to talk about is something a little bit different, and also how to take this data and integrate it with your existing data. And that's I think where the magic happens. So what we want to do is we want to start prioritizing all of the different possibilities, right? Once you say, okay, we're going to go beyond the boundaries of our enterprise, and we're going to look at all the data sets that are available across the world, it's a pretty daunting task, right? So we come up with a method in order to help prioritize things, right? And this should be fairly familiar to anybody who did any kind of data strategy before, but we're taking it and we're applying it towards very specific needs for figuring out how to make your company survive during this pandemic. So what we do is we take all of the different possibilities, all the different types of data, all the different possible outcomes of data, and then we figure out, if we were able to do this, what's the business value of doing it? And if we were to decide that it's high business value or even low business value, what would it take to actually implement it, collect it, clean it, conform it, consolidate it, analyze it, build models, and then get insight out of it, and then make decisions with it, and maybe even embed it in your business applications so that your business applications could make decisions based on this data going forward without human intervention. So so just this slide, the way this would work is you would go through and say, okay, if we were to do a COVID impact analysis, is that more important right now than analyzing credit card transactions? Probably close, actually, though, right? Because if you are an e-com, credit card transactions are a pretty good indicator as to whether the health of your business. It could actually be used in concert with the COVID impact analysis, right? One indicator is good, 2 indicators are better, 3 indicators actually makes a pattern that you can actually follow to give you some credibility in some of your decision making. So once you have that, now you have your plan, now you can start building it out. So I just put out there for everybody to see how this would work. If you already have corporate alignment on moving forward towards an alternative data strategy, you could skip step 1. If you already have a data lake and a data foundation in order to build upon it, you could skip step 2. And then you would just start with ingesting new data sets, building models to analyze those data sets, and integrating it with your existing infrastructure and existing data. Should take anywhere from like 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks total to do that. This slide indicates that maybe you don't have a CI/CD environment yet. So part of what we would suggest going forward as you go through the other phases of your roadmap is to, part of your implementation would be to stand up a DevOps/data ops environment where you can start doing CI/CD deployments continuously with all of the new sources and alternative data that you get from this point forward. So how does that happen? So I took a traditional supply chain management plan, and because what we're doing is we're talking about acquiring data, constructing data, delivering data, and then consuming data. It's just like any other product. And I also want to take this opportunity to talk about a book out there that's worth reading, and it's called Infonomics, written by Doug Laney, who works for Caserta. And I don't recommend it because he works for Caserta. I recommend it because it's a book that talks about treating your data like an asset. And this is even more of a reason to think of data as a supply chain, because with any asset, you have supply chain, right? In order to acquire those assets and sell those assets, or at least consume those assets. So what we do is we take this 5-step approach: planning, sourcing data, constructing the data, delivering the data, and consuming the data, and turning it into a landscape. And this landscape does a couple of things that I just want to highlight. One is the plan is going through an iterative process of figuring out how to set goals, how to assess risk, how to communicate what it is you're about to endeavor, and then how do you measure the success, right? That planning process will launch finding data, integrating data, delivering your data, and then using your data to change your business. I threw a couple of tools out there. It doesn't matter. Like, don't get hung up on the tools. This could be done on AWS, it could be done on Azure, it could be done on GCP, it could be done on the server under your desk. It doesn't matter. What matters is the process and the architecture of it. So I'll walk through it very quickly. The sources include alternative data, which is some of the external data sources, things like news feeds and flight itineraries, and whatever you decide you need, web scraping of prices, and also it includes internal data like your accounting systems, your investor data, and then an integration process where it all goes together. And it could be streamed, it could be batched, it's probably going to be a little bit of both. And then you need some kind of set of libraries where you could start building some algorithms using natural language processing, regression models, k-means clustering, neural nets, whatever it is that you decide that you need. We're going to go over a couple that are used for a specific use case, so will Abraham. And then being able to consume that data, and then also being able to take that data and integrate it with your business applications. So one specific use case that I took is where we took news feeds coming in from Bloomberg, Financial Times, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. And we went through a data process where we extracted those data feeds coming in, streaming in, and we used natural language processing algorithms, NMF and LDA, which basically took all of the phrases that appeared in the same articles as the terms COVID-19 and coronavirus. And then we took those phrases and we quantified them, and we basically said, okay, here are the phrases that are used along in the same breath as coronavirus. And we figured out the sentiment of these phrases as well. So is it a positive phrase or a negative phrase? And it should be no surprise. Apple would be at the top of this list, right? Because all of their products are made in China, where the coronavirus apparently started. Not to make this political, but this is some data. And this whole process can be used for any type of event. So you could take that very first where the gears are, where we filtered all of the news for coronavirus and COVID. You could filter for anything that fits your business. You could filter it on George Floyd. You could filter it on Black Lives Matter. You could build it on whatever you think might be impacting your business. And then go through this same process and try to figure out, maybe it's not other companies, maybe it's your own products, maybe it's names of your employees in social media. Like the limit of what you can do with this process is only limited to your imagination and your business needs. So where do you get this data from, right? So there's no shortage of brokers. You can go out and scour the internet yourself and do it manually, or you can engage some of these brokers. Quandl is one of these brokers. Circle there, and Abraham will talk about how easy it is to use Quandl data, even within the Quandl environment, without going through the whole extract, transform, load process. App Annie on the top right is if you want to get app data, you know, to try to figure out if companies are getting more users on their mobile devices or not. Very indicative of the health of a business. And if you're interested in any of these, we can have an offline conversation. I explain. We've used probably 70% of the logos here with many of our clients. So I do want to talk a little bit about where we are in order to get all of this done. And I covered some of this, but I just want to make you realize that building a data analytics ecosystem, right, in order to actually leverage your data is just, it comes in many forms. And, you know, it started, we walked through some of these. We walked through the use cases. We walked through the data ecosystem. We walked through the tools and technologies. We walked through the actual data itself. We walked through data integration. The last part we didn't really talk to yet. The last part is the culture in the organization. Now, taking a company that has been doing things a certain way for a certain number of years and asking them to abandon all of that and do it a new way on something they've never done before, on data they've never experienced before, is something very different, and it's a lot to ask of anybody, right? So what we suggest is that you go through looking at the maturity of all of these different dimensions of the business, all of the different ways of assessing, are you actually ready to do this? You may or you may not be. In the old days, we used to call this the litmus test, right? Now we call this the analytics maturity model, where we have a very structured way of measuring, can you actually do this internally? Do you have the ability to evolve and survive through some of the world's worst circumstance? And then you measure it, right? We take each of those dimensions and measure it, and then we can actually help you with a roadmap to get you to where you need to be in a very, very short amount of time to get you so that you can actually be alternative data ready. Okay. In order to do this, you would need to create a communication plan internally so that you can get everybody to rally around this new way of doing business and this new way of looking from the outside in instead of from the inside out. Basically taking everything you know, turning it on its head, right? So you need to come up with a very thoughtful communication plan and embed it into your culture, right? Because this is not a temporary fix, right? This is a new reality, and this new reality is most likely, my chips are on, this new reality is not going to go back to the old reality. And the reason for that is because it's so much more efficient once you get there. It would be a shame to not do it, right? So the only way to do it is to do it. So the way to do it is establish the change management process, create the alternative data framework, do as much automation as you possibly can, find brokers like Quandl and other vendors to be able to get the data for you and source the data, enable build the supply chain ecosystem, and then start building it through agile methods. I do highly recommend, whether it's Caserta or some other firm, leverage consultants, find somebody who's been there, done that, so it's not so much trial and error taking longer than it should, which will cost more than it should. And it just so happens that Caserta does all these things. So with that, I will turn it over to Abraham. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was very insightful. And Abraham, now we're going to turn it over to you for the second part of the presentation. Bear with me one moment. All right, Abraham, all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Remy. And thank you, Joe, for that was a very, very insightful 20-odd minutes talking about the entire ecosystem of alternative data. It's easy to kind of lose the forest for the trees and focus on data engineering or data science or data acquisition. But what your presentation, I think, brought home to me and hopefully the audience as well is how it all needs to be part of an integrated whole. And it needs to start with just having the right culture in place and kind of organizational buy-in and all these different technical challenges, as well as all these different kind of process and logistical challenges. So it is a large undertaking, no question about that, but it is one that in our experience, and I'm sure in the experience of your clients as well, one that pays off many times. So what I'm going to do in my part of today's webinar is take that high-level framework that Joe presented and show how it applies in a very, very specific use case. And so I'm going to walk our audience through one particular way in which one particular set of alternative data and how it can be used. And I've decided to focus on the airline industry specifically, and there's a few good reasons for that we'll come to in just a minute. So just a quick outline of my talk. We'll start by, as I mentioned, focus on the airline industry and why airlines, what's special about them. Go into that a little bit. I will talk about sources of data because, as Joe said, in this day and age, one needs external data. So there's a lot of different sources of information about airlines. So where can one get those? I'm going to zoom in on one particular source, which is what I call air travel intent. And then we're going to talk about case studies, how this data can be used and how different organizations are in fact getting value out of it. Finally, we're going to open it up to some discussion. Joe and I will no doubt have lots of questions for each other. And if we get time as well, we might be able to handle some audience questions, which Remy will be moderating. So let's jump straight in. Why airlines? Why did I choose airlines for this talk? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is that airlines are just a very, very powerful macro indicator. And as Joe mentioned, we live in a time when macro is everywhere, right? You can't just focus on your own business. You need to kind of know what's going on in the world as a whole with the virus, with trade wars, with civil unrest, and so on. And because these forces will impact your business no matter what that business is. And the airline industry tends to be a really good early warning signal for the strength of the macroeconomy for a couple of reasons. Obviously, airlines are, business travel is a big component of airline revenues, and business travel is indicative of corporate performance and sales, the strength of commercial relationships, are companies expanding into new geographies, and so on. When the economy is doing well, there tends to be more business travel. Similarly, when the economy is doing well, there tends to be more personal travel because airlines are a channel for discretionary and luxury spending. When you have disposable income, you go on vacation, you travel. So it's one of those sectors that captures both the business side as well as the consumer side. And so just from a conceptual level, it's a very powerful macro indicator. It's also especially relevant in the era of COVID-19, obviously because it directly impacted. One of the first things that people did was they stopped traveling. Everybody wants to be at home. Nobody wants to be stuck in an enclosed space with other potential carriers of the disease. It's something that has an immediate response, by which I mean, let's say that there's a crisis in the energy industry. It still takes weeks to months to shut down your oil rigs and your refineries because shutting down, and for that matter, reopening, it's a really expensive and complicated process. It costs billions of dollars. It takes weeks. Whereas with airlines, if you decide not to travel, you can change your plans instantly. So it's a very fast signal in that sense. And then the final part is that it's forward-looking. And this is actually quite unique to airlines, is that people make their purchase decisions well before they actually travel. So so that means that there's an element of expectations. It doesn't just reveal what's happened in the past, it reveals what people and businesses are thinking about for the future. And that is super useful because as we all know, so much of the economy and so much of markets and so much of business performance is in fact driven by expectations on the part of businesses and on the part of customers. And then finally, of course, if you're at all within the airline industry, if you're an investor or a counterpart to the airline industry, you care about airline data because you care about individual carriers and routes and hubs. You care about patterns on a regional or country level. You care about, in the midst of a crisis, you care about the timing and the trajectory of the downturn and the recovery. You care about all the industries that revolve around the airline industry. So we're talking aircraft manufacturers, the airline parts industry, jet fuel and energy and kerosene and airport services, and of course the entire hospitality complex of hotels and convention centers and restaurants and entertainment. They're all related. So if you get that early indicator of air travel, it has insights and implications for all those other industries. And as I mentioned again, airlines are the most forward-looking of those. So for all these reasons, airlines are a very good lens through which to view the world. And it's the classic example. If you're a hedge fund and you're trading, if you're a macro hedge fund, you're used to looking at the world in this way. But there are many other industries and sectors which we're seeing, and they include many Quandl clients, who have begun to look at the world in this precise way, and try to position themselves the same way a macro hedge fund would. Okay, great. So we're interested in airline data. What does that actually mean? How would one go about getting that data and especially how would one get it ahead of time? Because it's not enough to have information. You also need to have information that other people don't have in order to get an advantage in the market. I mean, it's a competitive world. Well, a good way to approach this, and this is kind of this ties into what Joe described earlier as the exploration of the landscape. A good way to understand any data landscape is to think about all the economic steps that occur, or even actually the physical steps that occur during a given process. So think about air travel. There's the day of travel, but well before the day of travel, there's the ticket purchase, and even before the ticket purchase, there's my intent to travel, which includes my flight research. I'm looking for cheap flights, booking my stay, doing that kind of stuff. And then, of course, after the day of travel, you get the actual. It shows up in the airline company's revenue and the reporting and government statistics and so on. And this is what we call an information flow diagram. It kind of depicts all the phases. And associated with each of these phases, there are different sources of information. So, for example, right at the end, after flights have happened, the airlines report their quarterly earnings. The U.S. government reports a bunch of aggregates. A bunch of carriers report their, monthly revenue passenger miles. So those are great data sets, but they're all kind of late. I mean, I don't want to wait until September to know that flight traffic fell off a cliff in March, especially in this time of COVID. On the day of travel, there's a few data sets that you could look at. So some of the classic ones are flight tracking that Joe mentioned, and foot traffic. So you can actually find out how many people are visiting airports. It's a little noisy, it's a little messy, but it's faster. Even before that, when people buy tickets, that action leaves behind quite a strong signature in the form of credit card transactions, email receipts, It shows up if, in fact, if lots of people are buying tickets for a particular flight, you'll see the number of seats going down and you'll see the prices going up. So it actually shows up on kind of the web. And then even before that, even before you buy a ticket, there's a bunch of information related to flight intent. And that's the earliest. It's, of course, the noisiest one, because just because I search for a flight doesn't mean that I'm going to actually buy a ticket, but it is certainly very, very fast. And you'll notice, and this is an important point, is that there are trade-offs. There are always trade-offs when choosing what data you want to work with. Typically, these trade-offs around speed versus accuracy versus granularity versus coverage. I mean, it would be nice if you could find a data set that ticked every single box, but the reality is those aren't always available. So for example, the official reporting from earnings statements, the government statistics, yeah, they're accurate, but they're really, really slow and they're very aggregated. You don't get much granular detail. Footfall and flight tracking and stuff like that, it's very, very inaccurate. You're kind of guessing that there are number of people who visited the location of the general location of the airport has got something to do with traffic. Yeah, it's probably true, but it's a noisy estimate. Credit card transactions are they're fast and they're accurate, but there's not enough detail. All that shows up is, I spent $1,200 on a purchase from United. Did I buy, was that one ticket or 4 tickets? Was that a flight, a transatlantic flight, or was it just a hop from New York to Chicago? I mean, these questions are important to know where people are going and how much they're paying and what airline revenues are going to look like. Same with email receipts. You get a bit more detail, but those panels tend to be really small. And so the coverage, the lack of coverage means that your accuracy is now compromised. And then you have search and click and intent, which is kind of the fastest and the most detailed, but it's potentially noisy because, as I said, not every search results in a purchase. So there's always trade-offs, and this is an important thing to understand with alternative data. It's never going to be perfect, but the hope of the expectation is that you can, by asking the right questions and doing the right analysis, you can get insights that you didn't have before. And sometimes those insights might come from the granularity, other times they might come from accuracy, sometimes they come from speed. And right now, kind of specifically June of 2020, I would say that the need for speed is higher than ever before. And that's simply a function of the world we live in. I mean, we just saw, again, the events are moving incredibly rapidly this year, just in terms of the stock market. We saw the biggest drop ever, 35% in a matter of weeks. Not the biggest drop ever, but the fastest drop ever, followed by the fastest rebound ever. Unprecedented unemployment numbers, unprecedented small business closures, but also unprecedented profits for certain companies like Zoom. So when things move this fast, it's really, really vital to know what's going on and to know what's happening fast. And so the macro conditions create a need for speed. And I want to mention that there's 2 distinct types of speed which, as data analysts, you need to be aware of. One is this idea of the speed of the signal. In other words, an event happens, how quickly does that event show up in your data? Are you waiting 6 months for the government to report about it, or does it show up the very next day in say your intent database? So there's that. But there's also this concept of time to value. You might have a very fast signal, but then if it requires 3 months of data science and then 3 months of data engineering before you can actually act on that information, that's not very useful either. So there is definitely a kind of a potency that comes from having data that is quick, that you can work with very, very rapidly. So let's talk about air travel intent, because I promise I want to do a deep dive into one particular data set. And of all these trade-offs that we talked about and of all these different sources of data that I showed in this information graph, air travel intent is the fastest. And we think that makes it really interesting. So what is air travel intent? Well, it's a database that Quandl we discovered and we're bringing to market. And I just want to talk real quickly about Quandl and what we do. So we're a technology firm. We used to be a startup where I guess we're a bit too big to be considered a startup anymore. And we've been acquired by NASDAQ a short while ago. And we're one of the pioneers of this entire category of alternative data for finance. We kind of defined the term and created the entire ecosystem. Our audience is mostly within the finance industry. So it started out being hedge funds, then it became asset managers and investment banks and of all types. And now increasingly we're getting a lot of corporate clients as well who are realizing the same signals that hedge funds use to invest in particular companies or sectors or economies are also useful to corporations as they plan their business activities. So what is it that we do for all these clients? Well, we help them discover and productize untapped data assets. So we go out into the wilderness and we find new and unusual data sets. And the truth is, most of the data out there, there's a ton of data in the world. Most of it is not that valuable. So a big part of what we do is filtering out the gold from the dross. And also, a lot of the data is hard to work with. It's raw, it's unstructured, it's messy, it's noisy. So we have a data science and data engineering team that takes these raw data assets and converts them into very simple, very actionable, ready-to-use insights. And we're going to see that in a few minutes. And that, again, comes back to the point I was talking about earlier about time to value. So we do the entire data acquisition, data science, data delivery team. We are definitely a data company, so we're not in the business of selling analytics or kind of selling signals or reports or advice. And so we work with consultants like Caserta to get our data into the hands of people who can find value from it. So we often collaborate along those lines. And like I mentioned, our customers are asset managers, corporations, investment banks, and very sophisticated institutional investors. So let's talk about air travel intent, which is a data set that we've actually brought to market quite recently. And so this comes from a very, very popular global travel website. And conceptually, it's quite simple. It's a person goes to this website and they search for the flights that they're interested in. They search, they do their research, they compare prices, they compare routes and itineraries, and eventually they click through to buy the actual ticket from the underlying airline. And it turns out that that action is strongly correlated with actual passenger flights. So we'll get to that in a minute. Just a quick recap of overview of the data. Obviously, it has all these fields like the customer details, which are anonymized, your search date, your departure date, your trip details, your booking details, the pricing. It's very, very rich and granular. That's because it's first-party data. This is kind of, this is inside baseball for the data nerds. But the more granular the data you have, the better the questions and the better the insights you can achieve. The other nice thing about this data set is that it's really, really massive. 80 million users, 200 countries, pretty much every airline and airport and route in the map in the world. And so that allows you to get a very, very comprehensive picture. And with that comprehensive picture, well, what can you do? Well, for starters, and I talked about it earlier, you're looking at searches and clicks, but it turns out you can predict RPM, which stands for revenue passenger miles. That's like the most fundamental indicator for the airline industry. It's like how many passengers, how many miles were traveled by revenue-paying passengers. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a strong indicator of the overall revenue for airlines. And as you can see, you're looking at your clicks and pick two airlines, Allegiant and Delta. There's such a strong correlation. I mean, this tight scatter that you see on the left, that's the kind of thing you almost never ever see because the world is a noisy and messy place. But this is a really powerful data set. And obviously, if you're a quant hedge fund, you can use a systematic strategy where you buy companies that are doing well, you sell companies that are doing badly. That's fine. It makes money. That's early adopters. That's the kind of stuff they do. But there's so much more that you can do. You can look at price curves. You can look at how airlines are altering their pricing based on the time to departure. You can look at the forward yield curves, like how busy our flight's going to be. You can look at market share. So this is just looking at the market share for American. As you can see, market share has actually been declining for several years, and the stock price has been on a downward slope even before COVID-19. That little downward spike beginning of last year, that's the 737 MAX, which is obviously they had to ground a lot of flights. And you can actually drill down and see that more in a more granular sense, right? If you look at the hubs, hub traffic, look at American's hub at Dallas-Fort Worth. They went from having 40% market share to 30% market share in a matter of 3 months. That's huge. 10 points in 3 months, that's insane. And by contrast, Delta's Atlanta hub, traffic hardly budged. And the reason is obvious. Delta does not fly the 737 MAX. And so, their traffic was unaffected. And of course, American had to rejig their operations. When you lose market share like that, they reconfigured their network, they changed their prices, they diverted flights, they did whatever it took to get their market share back up to 40%. And this has spillover effects into the economy of the Dallas-Fort Worth region. It has spillover effects on American suppliers, and tells you a lot about what consumers are up to and their choices. And that's kind of a micro example. I mean, you can do a lot of others. I'm going to kind of zoom through these. You can see that you can judge pricing power for businesses. You can compare kind of economy class versus routes that have a heavier number of business users. But kind of most interesting is looking at what's happening in 2020. So let's look at airlines in 2020. And for that, I'm just going to pull up this dashboard that I have here. And this is, again, based on the same underlying data. So, and this is just to give you a flavor. So here I'm just looking at the number of flights that each airline operates. I'm going to switch it out a bit. Instead of flights, I'm going to look at the number of passengers. And then I'm going to look at it by country. So that tells you an interesting story. For example, you can see that countries are, the blue line is 2019, the orange line is 2020. You can see that countries are recovering. Germany and Spain, definitely flights, they're not back up all the way, but they're definitely going back. Japan, South Korea, less so. That's an interesting insight. If you want to, and you can obviously drill down, you don't have to do it at a country level, you could do it at the level of individual airports. Or you can look at it at the level of individual routes. So for example, I'm looking here at passengers, but here you have Incheon and Heathrow. Now I'm looking at flights from, say, Osaka to Seoul. So there's all sorts of drill downs that you can do. Here's another one that I always find interesting, which is this idea of days to departure. So, when you search for a flight, how far in the future do you search? Historically, it's actually a very, very constant number. Those are the blue lines. It's very, very steady over time. But obviously with COVID-19, that changes. So let's look at the United States here. When the crisis first hit, days to departure actually dropped dramatically. And that's because people were rushing to get home or rushing to complete their business travel or their vacation travel. Then it increased a great deal. In other words, people were not searching for flight 1 month away, they were searching for flights like 6 and 7 months away because it's a crisis. Nobody knows when the pandemic is going to be over. So everybody wanted to hold back. And then we kind of see that in the United States, at least, days to departure has actually returned to pretty much its 2019 level. That's really interesting. It shows that passengers in the US kind of feel that the worst of the crisis has passed them and they're returning to their old travel patterns. And in fact, that's not what we see in the United Kingdom or in South Korea or in some of these other countries. Germany is somewhat halfway between those other extremes. So, the larger point here is if you have a rich and powerful data set, the insights that you can get are limited only by your imagination. Obviously, you have to do a lot of work to get there. You have to do a lot of work to find the data and clean it and structure it, to create these dashboards, to integrate it, to acquire it, to kind of create a data-driven culture throughout your organization. But just this little tidbit that I shared today, the fact that airline passengers in the United States have mostly returned to normal or returned to 2019, whereas that's not the case for the United Kingdom, and Germany is halfway between. That in itself is an incredibly valuable tidbit, whether you're an investor in airlines or whether you are a participant in the airline industry or adjacent to the airline industry, or for that matter, if you're in any industry at all that relies on or is dependent on consumer behavior in our COVID world. And that's the kind of insight and the kind of power that alternative data can give you. And with that, I'm going to bounce it back to Remy. I don't know how much time we have left, probably not a lot, but maybe we can squeeze in a few questions or have a quick little discussion here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Abraham. That was very insightful. I enjoyed learning about those alternative data sets with the airlines and drilling down. Some great insights there. We now open the floor to Q&A. We have just about 8 minutes or a little shy of it. So if you would like, please ask Abraham or Joe your questions in the questions panel of GoToWebinar, and we can get started with that. Our first question we have is, and this is just general for the floor, what are some of the challenges of integrating alternative data into our platform right now? So I guess this is a how-to question of how could they integrate alternative data into their existing analytics platforms.
So I'll take a stab at that. I think of the data process as, and I'm just talking about the data side of things. Joe, perhaps you could pitch in with the kind of the broader technological side and the cultural side separately. From the data side of things, there's always just 4 steps, right? Acquire, transform, apply, and deploy. So you first have to find the right data. There's a ton of data out there. You don't necessarily know what the right data is for your needs. And even once you've found it, you have to kind of, you have to go through the entire getting the right licensing and compliance and negotiating contracts. So there's a whole that's an exercise in itself. The second part is transforming the data. This is taking raw data and converting it into an actionable, into a tractable format. The joke I always like to say is, if you take 25 petabytes of raw satellite images and you dump them on my desk, I wouldn't know what to do with them. But if you transform them into some sort of much more analytically tractable form, now all of a sudden I can ask meaningful questions. So there's an entire transformation set. The first two, these are both, and then the third part is the application part. This is actually where I find the largest challenges, because both the acquisition and transformation, yes, they require work, but these are known. You know what to do. You just have you have a checklist and you can just work your way through it. The application part is tricky because you don't know in advance what the application is. You might have a question that you want to answer, but maybe there's no data that answers that question. Or maybe you have access to some interesting data and you don't know what the question is. And this is the thing, there's not always a perfect match. So asking the right questions, figuring out the right applications, the right insights, that requires ingenuity and creativity. And that's the part where a lot of folks stumble because it's not data that they've worked with. It's not a type of data that they've ever worked with before. And then the final step is deploying, which is getting it into production. And that, again, it's largely an engineering challenge, which is not to diminish it in any way, because once you put data into production, it has to be 100% rock solid, reliable, up to date, accurate, and making actual business decisions based on the data. You cannot afford any slippage. So there's a lot of work there. But for me, it's always the application stage, which is where people, where I see a lot of friction happening. The other thing I'll point out is that these data sets, there's no magic wand. You can't wait. You can't kind of click you can't do it overnight. You have to commit. It takes time and effort to do all these steps, and it can also be expensive. And I feel that a lot of people come in with unrealistic expectations because they read some story about a hedge fund use some data to make billions of dollars in profit, and they think it's easy. It's not easy.
Joe, would you like to chime in?
I'll just add, yeah, I think Abraham covered most of it, but there's two other pieces I think that are worth talking about. So one is when you're looking to bring this data into your existing ecosystem, your existing enterprise, one of the biggest challenges is integration. So, you know, when you, let's say you wanted to do that analytics that Abraham showed where you're looking at, you know, say you have a position with American Airlines and Delta, or any company, right? You need to be able to understand the unique identifier on whatever source that you have no control over for that particular company. Bring it in and then align it with the unique identifiers within your ecosystem. Sounds easy, not easy, right? It's usually what happens, what we've been doing with our clients is building a graph that connects the dots between the unique identifiers in the alternative data and the unique identifiers within your enterprise, right? And making sure that the vectors between the nodes in that graph are actually understood, communicated, and shared with the user community. One of the other things when you're doing that type of integration is understanding point in time analysis. One of the things that we're seeing as a trend during this pandemic is M&A transactions, right? Because smaller companies are struggling, bigger companies are buying distressed companies. So getting the tickers right at the point in time where they actually are the entity you're analyzing is very important. So being able to, when you're building your graph, understand at what point in time is the data that you're collecting valid and when is it not valid, and how do you aggregate that data across the M&A transactions. Something also sounds easy, not trivial at all, needs to be figured out. And then the second part is credibility. When you're doing analysis on data that's unknown, there's strength in numbers. So let's say, for example, you're doing analysis on the health of an airline. Looking at the flights is an indicator. It's an indicator. It's right. But if you take that and you couple it with what are the, you know, using satellite data to count the cars in the parking lot at the airports, that's also an indicator, right? If there's no one parking in the lots, maybe there's no one getting on the planes. People could be buying tickets but not actually traveling. So if you are in the business of you know, being at a destination, right, and you're going by purely by ticket sales, you may be actually setting yourself up to fail. You know, and then there's credit card data, right, making sure that people are actually not only reserving it and buying it, but actually paying for it, right? Each one of these, whether you're counting the flights or counting the cars or counting the transactions, any one of them is an indicator, but it's not really telling the whole story. It's when you are using alternative data, it's best to get different data points and then look for patterns across those data points. And when they're all pointing in the same direction, it's a pretty safe bet that whatever direction they're going in indicates the health of the company.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I always like to use.
Thank you, guys. That's
it's like
all the time we have for today. We'll have to do a follow-up webinar on alternative data because this was an excellent discussion. So thank you both for your awesome presentations. And one announcement, next week we're doing another webinar together with Denodo all about best practices in the cloud for data management. If you already have data, you are engaged in data management, so you need to be sure to do it effectively. So tune in next week for our next episode in the Data Intelligence webinar series. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.